The RAF Hercules takes 13.5 hours to get from Ascension Island to Stanley, an experience no traveller is likely to forget. The noise rattles your ears, the cold freezes your bones, but the welcome is warm. And the pace quickens when you discover that your transport is part of the spoils of war, an Argentine cross-country vehicle with the right kind of suspension for the job. The road from Stanley is atrocious. Bouncing along, you pass temporary campsites and battle positions. Many of the dazzling white sandy beaches are heavily mined, no-go areas. Breakfast under canvas with a field squadron of the Royal Engineers. Waiting in line for my share of the eggs, bacon and beans, I hear a familiar seashore cry. On the roof of the Stanley Post Office, kelp gulls. The gulls are here for the usual reason. There's an abundance of kitchen scraps. Wherever there's a source of easy food, gulls are sure to find it, even in the South Atlantic. Kelp gulls are the sub-Antarctic version of our blackbacks, noisy scavengers. But here at Moody Brook, they're not the only ones attracted to the scraps.
The big ones out there and amongst the gulls are giant petrels, birds which roam the Southern Ocean just looking for scraps of this and that. They breed here in the Falkland Islands, and the locals call them stinkers.
Giant petrels are huge birds with a wingspan well over 2 meters, and they have these huge plated bills, tube noses. Most birds don't use their sense of smell, but maybe the stinkers do, to locate floating offal far out at sea. They're killers and scavengers. They follow ships for the galley refuse. The blacker they are, the younger they are. Even this juvenile giant petrel makes the big kelp gulls look small. At the time of my visit, General David Thorne commanded the British forces in the Falklands. He has a strong interest in the wildlife.
Yes, I do. I'm not an expert at all, but I have a great affection and liking for animals and birds. And of course, before I came here, I had read a bit about the Falklands, obviously, and I realized it was a great natural center for wildlife. And so I went to Lord Buxton and to one or two others, and I educated myself and realized that I'd have to take special care of this aspect of the service presence here when I came down.
Now, there are vast rookeries of penguins and albatrosses here, as well as sea mammals. Was the wildlife much disturbed during the conflict?
Well, I can't say, because I wasn't here then, but I suspect that it probably wasn't, because all the wildlife here is centered round the edges of the islands, just like all the people are here. And of course we did a great deal of the fighting up the centre, up the mountains, Mount Tumbledown, Longdon, Mount Kent. I grant you Goose Green is by the sea, but then not too many penguins actually at Goose Green. So I think the wildlife managed very well, as it so often does.
And indeed, General Thorne was right. So far as I could find out, the only wild casualties of the war were the flightless steamer ducks, the loggers, which are rather thinly spread along the Stanley waterfront since the Argentinians used them for target practice. Doubtless they'll soon be back to full strength, for they're tough and aggressive birds found only in the Falklands.
These islands were discovered in 1592 by John Davis, a sea captain from Dartmouth in Devon. And then in the late 18th century, the sealers and whalers arrived to make their fortunes. They took the skins and the oil from vast congregations of seabirds and sea mammals. In fact, they nearly took the lot, and the trade petered out. In the mid-19th century, the sheep farmers came here, and sheep are still the major industry. But to see them, you have to go into the interior.
General Thorne had arranged for me to hitch a lift in a scout helicopter, an ideal way to spy out the lie of the land. From Stanley, we passed over Mount Kent and on to Teal Inlet, the settlement where David Barton farms 110,000 acres with 22,000 head of sheep. The pasture is poor, though it's well enough suited to hardy sheep. But the sheep aren't the only creatures eating his grass, especially when he improves it. He finds it's being enjoyed by the wild geese.
Well, it's the upland goose, mainly we have here, the male being the white, the one. And in the spring they congregate a lot around the settlement, as we call it, the paddocks, where the grass is usually a bit greener than it is in the outside camp. And then at this time of year, or a bit earlier on in December, quite a lot of them shed their wing feathers, so they can't in fact fly. And when they do that, they always concentrate on the coast or in freshwater ponds.
It's rather a hard life here, isn't it?
Well, on occasions it is, but I mean, on a day like this, we wouldn't be anywhere else.
Tame birds by nature, the upland geese, enjoying the green grass and the freshwater ponds of the settlements. Persecuted by the farmers, shot for food, and yet because of the vast open spaces of the Falklands, there are plenty of them. It's been called a barren and inhospitable country, but that's a rash judgment. True, there are hardly any trees, but there are fine expanses of moorland, tundra country. And the coastline is magnificent. This is West Falkland, an island surrounded by islets. West Point Island, fine cliffs and a natural harbour, almost landlocked and overlooked by the settlement. This island is farmed by Roddy and Lily Napier. I brought them Christmas presents from England. They invited me to see their bird colonies. Even from the air, we'd seen our first albatross gliding on the upcurrents. And when the noise of the helicopter died down, I took the chance of talking to my pilot, Captain Alan Paul of the Army Air Corps.
Alan, I think you've got the best job in these islands. You must have seen every corner with a wonderful bird's-eye view. How do you think the war has affected the wildlife?
Well, you're right. We've seen just about every corner of the islands, and judging by the amount of wildlife I've seen, and all the other pilots as well, the war hasn't affected it at all.
And you've got all the places well charted, haven't you?
Yes, we've got maps with all the albatross and sea lions marked, everything that we might affect by flying over, so we steer well clear of them at all times.
There is a lot of potential danger, isn't there?
There is, if we fly too close to them in the breeding season or something like that, but not only to them, but to us. If we fly into albatross when we're flying along, it could be catastrophic for the aircraft, so it's in our interest as well as them to stay well clear.
This is the Devil's Nose on West Point Island, the location of one of several big bird rookeries. Other albatrosses call here, but the only ones which breed are the black-browed albatrosses, tens of thousands of them. And they share the rocky slopes with enormous numbers of rockhopper penguins. Smallest of the Falkland penguins, noisy and quarrelsome birds with piercing red eyes and yellow eyebrows and long yellow plumes. They have 2 chicks, but the black-browed albatross only lays 1 egg and raises 1 chick, safely tucked into the cup on top of a pillar of mud and grass. They do well here at a place where they've been undisturbed for centuries. 7 or 8 years old when they breed, yellow and pink bill with that distinguishing black line over and through the eye, sharing the nesting slopes in tolerable harmony with the rockhoppers. And they do hop rocks, out of the sea and up quite steep cliffs. On these outer islands, far from the war zones, it's safe to walk on the beaches, and it's a great pleasure to enjoy the comings and goings of the penguins. 5 species breed on the coast and shore of these islands. Superb seagoing birds, they're out of their element as soon as they set foot ashore. That's a Gentoo, the largest common penguin here, easy to recognize with the white bar over the top of the head. Off-duty Magellanic penguins, socializing. They breed underground in burrows, whereas the Gentoo penguins have their rookeries out in the open, on a fairly level patch of ground, perhaps a mile from the sea, perhaps right above the beach. The colonies are widespread in the Falklands, anything from a few dozen to a few thousand pairs, and in this case, the nest a carefully arranged circle of small stones. Older chicks lounge about, digesting their fish suppers. Younger ones are brooded by a parent. Usually the Gentoos raise 2 chicks. But there's one Falkland penguin which I hadn't expected to see. And it certainly made my day when I found 2 kings in amongst the Gentoos. Female birds sitting on the eggs. No nest, eggs tucked in over the feet. Almost extinct 100 years ago because of over-enthusiastic collectors. There's one well-known but small colony at Volunteer Point on East Falkland. But it seems that a very few kings are beginning to colonize other remote places, and that's really good news. But we had precious little time and flew on in search of more wild islands. On our way back to Stanley, Alan Paul took me for a look at Seal Point. From the air, it was a typical small outcrop, only a couple of acres of green surrounded by rocky ledges. But kelp geese call it home. That's the male bird, you can see it a mile off with its totally white plumage. The goose is a good deal less easy to see, well camouflaged as she incubates. A normal clutch is half a dozen eggs, but this family is reduced to 1 gosling. Family party stays together, feeding on the lettuce seaweed of this intertidal zone. Alan Paul had other work to do, but he landed on the rocky foreshore and left me to enjoy Seal Point for 2 hours. I'd have liked longer. There was a lot to see. The tussock grass is a famous Falklands speciality. It's good fodder, very nutritious. Unfortunately, the sheep eat its heart out and it tends to survive only when it's fenced or on offshore islands like this. Anything up to 3 meters high. It's a plant that's happiest where it's drenched by salt sea spray. Here at Seal Point, it gave me some cover and allowed me to approach very close to an animal paradise, a host of different nesting birds and a flourishing society of sea lions. A harem of cows, and a master bull, lord of all he surveys. While the older bull maintains a jealous guard over his group of females, the younger males stay close by at a safe distance or cruise about, waiting their chance to make a takeover bid. They're sociable animals, southern sea lions, with a lot to say. The black one is a pup, staying close to his mother, especially when the bull goes by. Marvelous furry mane, but fortunately for these sea lions, it has no commercial value, unlike that of the fur seals. That's a sheathbill, on the lookout for something to eat, some scraps from the sea lion's table. And the young dolphin gull is a scavenger too. It's a peaceful scene. The sea lions seem to have an easy time of it. Plenty of fish in the sea, and the young pups soon grow fat on the mother's rich, buttery milk. The sheathbills enjoy droppings from the penguin's table, but they also find goodness in the sea lion's excreta, curious though that may seem. The adult dolphin gulls were still sitting on eggs, reminiscent of our black-headed gulls, but with more delicate, dusky colouring. And beyond a watchful group of kelp gulls, in the distance, there was a gathering of the astonishing king cormorants, handsome birds with an orangey-yellow knot above the base of the bill. They're common here, breeding in close-packed colonies, making a column of mud, tussock grass and bits of seaweed, and lining the egg cup with dried grass. The chicks need to be kept off the ground because it's a stinking quagmire in between the nests. Flocks of young birds have their own gathering places not far away from the nesting area, and they didn't object to my joining them. Neither did the sheathbills mind it when I went to join them. It's one of the great pleasures of the Falklands that the birds are so tame. If you move quietly and slowly, they'll ignore it. Indeed, if you sit a few minutes, the sheathbills will actually sidle up and join you. I could have stayed at Seal Point for a few weeks, but instead I had to go back to Port Stanley, where a cruise ship, the famous Lindblad Explorer, had just anchored.
It's clear that these islands are a naturalist's paradise, so it's not surprising that they exert a powerful fascination on the sort of people who like travelling to distant places and seeing exotic birds.
Fresh in after the sea crossing from Chile, 60 wildlife explorers are ferried ashore to be met by a stern warning from Captain Gilson of the Army's Bomb Disposal Squad.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I please warn you of the dangers of touching anything which you suspect or don't understand, which you find lying on the ground. Because unfortunately in Stanley, there are still some grenades and other items of ordnance lying around which you haven't found, which are likely to be dangerous.
But it takes more than the chance of a few grenades to deter this band of naturalists, They had planned their trip long before the war with Argentina, and they were determined to tick off as many birds as possible under the guidance of an informed naturalist.
Mike, why have you come to the Falklands?
Basically, the ship makes trips down to the Antarctic, and the Falklands we consider forms an integral part of the trip. For one, it's an introduction to Antarctic and subantarctic wildlife. As you well know, Falklands itself has a superb collection of wildlife, and we find as an introduction into the trip, it's the best place available. And
how do you rate it as a wildlife area?
oh, excellent. I personally have been to just about all the subantarctic islands in the world, and the Falklands matches up to any of those in both quantity and number of species, so we think it's an excellent place to visit.
The cruise passengers from Lindblad Explorer are paying some £5,000 for their tour of Antarctica, so I went to Government House and asked the Civil Commissioner, Sir Rex Hunt, whether he thought the military operations were compatible with a healthy wildlife.
Well, let me say first that the military are very aware of our wildlife heritage, and the General himself is particularly keen that none of his military operations interfere with our wildlife. Most of his ranges are inland, where most of our wildlife, as you know, is around our shores, and he has been careful to locate his ranges away from the wildlife. We have got maps that have been produced showing where there is intense wildlife activity, and all helicopter pilots are instructed to keep away from those areas. I think that it is possible, even with this larger garrison, to have instructions and regulations that will preserve our wildlife.
You mentioned wildlife tourism. Just how great a potential do you think that has?
Well, it will always be selective. I mean, I think it will always be for the favoured few. It will certainly not be comfortable for enthusiasts to come down here, but I do think that we can encourage the wildlife lover, the bird watcher and the amateur photographer, and I think we can make a considerable amount of money and also offer some marvellous opportunities here for wildlife that people rarely get a chance to see in other parts of the world. I think if we can get air communications going again with the mainland, then I think we can get the right sort of tourists down here to capitalise on our wildlife.
Do you think there's an opportunity here to build bridges with Argentina? Is there a chance, do you think, that Argentinian wildlife tourists might come to see the birds and make the first overtures of friendship?
No, I'm afraid I don't see that, not for a long, long time to come. Really not unless the Argentines drop their claim to the sovereignty of these islands.
In the meantime, it's clear to any visitor that the Falklanders are very proud of the wildlife of these islands.
They are indeed, and they're very proud of the 5 varieties of penguin and the albatross and the mollymops, all the other things they have here, and I think that they will look after them for the future.